So imagine building a revolutionary flying drone, right? Like an absolute marvel of engineering, only to realize that actually building the machine was the easy part.
Oh, yeah. Always is.
Because legally raising the millions of dollars you need to manufacture it, that is a regulatory nightmare that could literally land you in federal prison if you check the wrong box.
Easily.
The journey from a startup idea in a garage to a publicly traded stock on Wall Street is the total minefield.
Yeah.
And if you're taking the Securities Industry Essentials exam, the SIE, it's a minefield you have to cross blindly. But today's deep dive is your cheat code to cross it safely.
Absolutely.
And real quick, this deep dive is brought to you by CertFuel. They've got a full Securities Industry Essentials course with adaptive study quizzes, smart flashcards, and unlimited practice exams that are weighted just like the real thing. So check it out at certfuel.com.
Yeah, and it is incredibly important to master this specific minefield because securities offerings make up a massive 16% of your entire exam.
Wow, 16%.
Yeah, that is 12 full questions dedicated just to how a company goes from desperately needing cash to actually getting that cash from investors and all the laws that govern that exchange.
12 questions. I mean, that is the difference between passing with flying colors and taking a very sad, very quiet car ride home from the testing center, just staring out the window.
Nobody wants that car ride.
No. So we're going to make sure you have this locked down. You are sitting for the SIE. You need to know how capital markets are born.
Right. And our mission today is to trace the exact journey of a security. We'll look at the people involved, the specific rules that govern how they act, the literal mountains of paperwork they have to file, and most importantly for you, the incredibly subtle legal traps the SEC sets up along the way.
The traps are the worst part.
They really are, because the exam is designed to test not just if you memorized a flashcard, but if you understand the underlying mechanics well enough to spot those traps.
Okay, so to make this stick, I don't want to just read you a list of rules. I want you to picture a guy. Let's call him Frank the founder.
Okay, Frank.
Yeah, Frank runs a profoundly absurd but highly ambitious startup. He is the CEO of Frank's Flying Flapjacks.
Oh, boy.
It is a drone delivery pancake service. You wake up, you hit a button on your phone, and a drone drops a hot syrup-covered short stack right onto your balcony.
I mean, the logistics of that are terrifying. The syrup-proofing alone for the drone rotors would require massive capital.
Exactly. The research and development costs for syrup-resistant aerodynamics are astronomical. Frank needs money. He needs capital. So you and I are going to follow Frank's journey through the financial markets to get that money.
Sounds like a plan.
But wait, before we dive into the mechanics, I want to frame something for you, the listener. Listen to me right now. The exam wants to trick you.
It does. It really does.
It will present a scenario that sounds completely reasonable and fair until you remember one specific, tiny regulatory detail. We are going to explicitly flag those moments today. We aren't just going to tell you what the rule is. We are going to explore why the rule exists.
Yeah.
Because if you understand the why, you cannot be tricked.
That critical thinking is essential. You know, a lot of these regulations trace back to the stock market crash of 1929. So there is this deep historical philosophy of protecting the public that drives every single rule we will discuss today.
Right. All right, let's get Frank his money.
Mm-hmm.
Frank is sitting in his syrup-stained garage. He realizes he can't just stand on the corner of Wall Street with a megaphone screaming, buy shares in my pancake drones.
No, the SEC frowns on that.
Yeah, he needs a guide. He needs someone to navigate the system, price his company, and find the buyers. Basically, he needs an investment banker.
And for Frank, let's introduce underwriter Ursula.
Underwriter Ursula. I like it.
Yeah, Ursula is a sharp-suited, highly experienced investment banker. Her job is to act as the quarterback for Frank's initial public offering, his IPO.
Right.
She is the bridge between the issuer, which is Frank, and the investing public. She advises him on the structure of the deal, the timing, the legal filings, and most importantly, the pricing.
Right, but I'm looking at this from Ursula's perspective. Frank wants to raise, let's say, $50 million.
That's a lot of flapjacks.
It is. So Ursula is looking at Frank's company, and she's thinking, this is a massive offering. I don't want to carry $50 million worth of heavy boxes of stock all by myself.
Right.
It's just too much exposure for her specific bank.
So she doesn't do it alone, right? She forms a team.
That's the standard practice.
Yeah.
She forms an underwriting syndicate.
A syndicate.
Yeah. A syndicate is simply a group of broker-dealers who band together to distribute a new issue of securities. Ursula retains the title of the lead underwriter or the book-running manager.
So she's still the boss.
Exactly. Yeah. She is the one negotiating directly with Frank. But she brings in other banking firms to be syndicate members.
But why do those other firms want to join? Just to be nice and help Ursula out?
Hardly. I mean, they join because they want a piece of the profit. The spread, which is the difference between what the public pays for the stock and what Frank actually receives, is divided up.
Okay, that makes sense. But by taking a piece of the profit, those syndicate members also take on a share of the financial risk, as well as the responsibility of distributing the shares to their respective clients.
Let's hover on that phrase for a second. Financial risk. Ursula and her syndicate members are legally on the hook here. They are committing capital.
Yes.
But let's say they formed a syndicate, they were ready to go, but they realize they just need more boots on the ground. They want pure distribution power, like more brokers making phone calls without inviting anyone else to take a cut of the actual risk. What's the mechanism for that?
That is when the syndicate brings in the selling group.
The selling group, okay.
Right. The selling group consists of additional brokerage firms that do nothing but help sell the offering to retail and institutional investors. For every share they successfully place, they earn a selling concession.
Which is like a finder's fee.
Exactly. It's a small slice of that overall spread.
Okay, let's test this logic. I want you, the listener, to think about this scenario. Let's say the market absolutely crashes the day before the IPO. People suddenly realize that flying blades and sticky syrup are a terrible combination.
A nightmare.
Right. Nobody wants Frank's flying flapjack stock. Not a single share sells. Who is legally left holding the bag for those unsold shares? Is it the syndicate or is it the selling group? What do you think?
This is exactly where the exam will try to get you. It will try to convince you that because the selling group was tasked with selling the shares, they bear the responsibility when the sales fail.
But that's wrong, isn't it?
Completely false. The syndicate is left holding the bag.
Exactly. The selling group takes absolutely zero risk. Zero. If they can't sell the shares, they literally just hand them back to Ursula and say, sorry, we tried.
Yep. They only help distribute shares for a fee.
Only syndicate members assume underwriting risk. So listen, if you see a question about financial liability for unsold shares, cross out any answer that includes the selling group.
It's a very clean line to draw in your mind. Syndicate equals risk and reward. Selling group equals zero risk, only a reward for successful sales.
Okay, now let's pivot the scenario slightly to understand a totally different type of advisor. What if Frank wasn't a startup founder in a garage? What if Frank was actually Mayor Frank, the head of a local municipality, and he needed $50 million not for drones, but to build a massive new suspension bridge?
Well, in that case, Mayor Frank is entering the municipal bond market, and he wouldn't just hire a standard corporate investment banker right off the bat. He would likely hire a municipal advisor.
A municipal advisor.
Right, and this brings up a crucial distinction governed by the MSRB, which is the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board.
This is a huge point of confusion for people because Ursula, our corporate investment banker, she is acting at arm's length with Frank, the founder, right? She wants to get a good deal for her banking firm, meaning she wants to buy the stock from Frank as cheaply as possible, and Frank wants to sell it to her for as much as possible.
Right. They are counterparties. They are negotiating against each other to find a middle ground.
Exactly. It's a commercial transaction. But a municipal advisor operates under an entirely different legal framework, don't they?
They absolutely do. Municipal advisors owe a strict fiduciary duty to their municipal clients.
Fiduciary duty?
Yes. They are legally bound by law, obligated to act in the best interest of the city, state, or county they are advising.
Okay, think about it like buying a house. Ursula, the corporate underwriter, is the seller of the house. She wants the highest price for her firm. You are the buyer. You want the lowest. You are at arm's length. But a municipal advisor is like your personal real estate agent. They legally have to fight for your best interests.
That's a great way to look at it. If Mayor Frank's advisor finds out that a certain underwriting deal is bad for the city, the advisor must tell the mayor, even if it kills the deal.
And the exam loves to test this distinction. Underwriters do not have a fiduciary duty to corporate issuers. Municipal advisors do have a fiduciary duty to municipal issuers. The MSRB enforces that aggressively to protect taxpayers from predatory financial deals.
Yep, keep that straight and you'll nail those questions.
Okay, so we have the front of house team sorted out. The bankers, the advisors, the syndicates. But if you've ever looked at a corporate structure, there is an entire backstage crew keeping the machinery of these securities running. We are talking about the transfer agent, the registrar, and the custodian.
Right, the operational side.
Yeah, and I always found these terms incredibly dry until I started visualizing Frank's company as a highly exclusive nightclub.
Oh, I like this. Analogies are the best way to handle the operational side of securities. Walk us through the nightclub.
Okay, let's imagine Frank's Flying Flapjacks goes public, and owning the stock is essentially having a VIP membership to this club. First, you have the transfer agent. They are regulated by the SEC. I want you to picture the transfer agent as the bartender, or maybe the head bookkeeper of the club.
Okay, so what is their specific operational role? What does the bartender do?
They are constantly tracking who is currently in the club and who owns what. If Ivan sells his shares to Sarah, the transfer agent cancels Ivan's old stock certificates, or his old drink tickets, in this analogy, and issues new ones to Sarah.
Got it.
They keep the active, breathing ledger of who currently owns the shares. And when the company makes a profit and decides to pay out dividends, it's the transfer agent who actually mails the checks or wires the funds to the shareholders. They do all the day-to-day administrative heavy lifting of ownership transfer.
That makes total sense. They handle the transactional flow, so where does the registrar fit in?
The registrar is the bouncer, or more accurately, the fire marshal auditing the club.
Okay, so they aren't handling the day-to-day transactions.
No, not at all. Their job is singularly focused on one major risk, ensuring the company doesn't issue more shares than it is legally authorized to issue.
This is a critical audit function. A corporation's charter explicitly states the maximum number of shares it can create. Let's say Frank's charter allows for exactly 1 million shares.
Exactly. The registrar stands at the door of the club with a clicker. The fire capacity is 1 million. If the transfer agent accidentally or maliciously tries to let in 1,000,001 shares, the registrar steps in, blocks the door, and says, "Nope, we are at capacity. You cannot issue more shares than the charter allows."
So they are the check on the transfer agent.
Yes, they are the independent auditor double-checking the transfer agent's math to prevent the dilution of the stock.
It's a brilliant system of checks and balances. The entity issuing the shares cannot be the same entity auditing the maximum limit.
Right. And finally, in this nightclub, we have the custodian.
The custodian is the vault in the basement.
Yes. They don't care who is at the party or what the fire capacity is. They just safekeep the physical assets.
Usually, a large bank or a trust company acts as the custodian, holding the actual cash, the physical stock certificates, or the digital equivalents securely so they can't be stolen or lost.
So bartender, bouncer, vault, transfer agent, registrar, custodian. If you keep those functional differences clear, you won't get tripped up when the exam asks who cancels old certificates versus who audits the outstanding shares.
Absolutely.
So Frank has his team. Ursula is ready to quarterback this thing. The bouncer and the bartender are hired. Now they are standing in the empty nightclub, and the next logical question Frank asks is, who are we actually inviting to this party?
And that decision changes the entire legal trajectory of the company.
It really is the first major fork in the road. They have to decide between a public offering and a private placement. And this decision dictates every single piece of paperwork and regulation that follows.
It's the difference between throwing a massive citywide block party where anyone can show up versus a highly secretive VIP-only dinner behind closed doors.
Okay, break that down. What's the block party?
The block party is a public offering. It's SEC registered. It is open to the general public, meaning anyone with a brokerage account can buy in. But because it is open to everyday people, the SEC requires a massive, exhaustive disclosure document called a prospectus.
Right, to ensure the public knows exactly what they are buying. But what about the private placement?
A private placement is exempt from full SEC registration. It is generally only open to wealthy, sophisticated investors known as accredited investors.
Because the government assumes they can take care of themselves.
Exactly. The government assumes that if you are a multimillionaire, you can afford to hire lawyers and accountants to evaluate a deal, so you don't need the SEC holding your hand.
Makes sense.
Instead of a publicly filed prospectus, these wealthy investors receive a private placement memorandum, or PPM.
We are going to dig incredibly deep into those private exemptions later, because there's a fascinating philosophical debate there about who gets access to wealth. But for now, let's say Frank wants the block party. He wants to be on the New York Stock Exchange. He is doing an IPO, an initial public offering.
Initial being the keyword. It is the very first time his formerly private company is selling stock to the public to raise capital.
Right. And let's say it's a huge success. The drones are flying, the pancakes are hot, the syrup is flowing. A year later, Frank realizes he needs even more money to expand into waffle drones. The IPO money is gone. So he does a follow-on offering. You might also see this called an additional primary offering.
Okay, so in both of those cases, the IPO and the follow-on offering, who receives the actual money from the investors who are buying the stock?
Frank's company gets the money. The issuer receives the proceeds. New shares are created out of thin air, sold to the public, and the cash goes directly into Frank's corporate bank account to build more drones.
Okay,
But here is a scenario I want you to think through. Listen carefully to the sequence of events.
go ahead.
Frank's company did its IPO. It was a massive success. A year later, Frank's very first early investor, a guy named Ivan the angel investor, decides he is tired of drones. He wants to sell his shares so he can buy a massive luxury yacht.
Good for Ivan.
Right. So Ivan calls his broker and sells his shares to the public in what is known as a secondary offering. Now, the public is buying those shares. Does Frank's company get any of that yacht money to build more drones? Give it a beat to think about it.
I see why people get confused by this. Because it's called an offering, people assume the company is raising capital.
Right, but logically, think about buying a used car. If I sell my used Ford F-150 to my neighbor, does the Ford Motor Company get a cut of that sale? No. I get the money because I own the truck.
Exactly. And that is the exact mechanism of a secondary offering. In a primary offering, like an IPO or follow-on, new shares are created and the issuer gets the money. But in a secondary offering, the shares already exist. Ivan owns them. He is the selling shareholder.
So when he sells them,
Ivan gets the money. Frank's company gets absolutely zero. They are completely left out of the economic transaction.
follow the money. Primary equals the company raises capital. Secondary equals the shareholder cashes out. Do not let the exam trick you into thinking a secondary offering benefits the issuer's balance sheet. Ivan is just buying his boat.
Now, let's look back at Ursula. She and Frank are sitting at a mahogany table, hammering out the terms of this IPO. Frank wants a guarantee that he's going to get his $50 million. But Ursula is calculating how much risk her banking firm is willing to stomach. This tension leads to the different types of underwriting commitments.
Right. Ursula has two main choices here for how she structures her relationship with Frank.
Yeah.
I want you to picture the difference between selling your car to a dealership versus selling your house with a real estate agent.
Let's unpack the car dealership first. This represents what we call a firm commitment underwriting.
Okay, when you want to get rid of your car quickly, you drive it to a dealership. They appraise it, and they offer to cut you a check right then and there. They buy the car from you, usually at a slight discount to what it's actually worth. But the moment they hand you that check, you are done. The car is their problem.
Right.
They polish it up, put it on their lot, and try to sell it to the public for a profit. If nobody buys it, or if a hailstorm destroys it, too bad for the dealership. They own it.
And in capital markets, under a firm commitment, Ursula buys the entire allotment of Frank's stock directly from his company at a discount. In legal terms, she is acting as a principal in the transaction.
The principal.
Yes. This represents the absolute highest risk for her firm because she has committed her own capital. If the public decides they don't want flapjack stock, Ursula's firm is literally left holding millions of dollars of worthless shares. They own them.
The exam wants you to inextricably link firm commitment with the word principal. When a firm acts as a principal, they are trading from their own inventory. They bought the asset, they own the asset, they take the risk.
Now contrast that with the real estate agent model, which represents a best efforts commitment.
Right. When you want to sell your house, your real estate agent doesn't buy your house from you. That would be insane. They just list it. They put it the signs, they run the open houses, they market it, they give it their best efforts to sell it to the public. If they find a buyer, they take a percentage commission. But if after 6 months nobody buys the house, they don't owe you the value of the house. They just give you the keys back and say, sorry, Frank, couldn't sell it.
Under a best efforts underwriting, Ursula does not buy a single share from Frank. She simply agrees to utilize her network to sell as much of the stock as possible to the public on Frank's behalf.
So she's just a middleman here.
Exactly. If she sells half of it, Frank gets half the money. The unsold shares are simply returned to Frank's company, or rather, they're just never issued. In this scenario, she is acting as an agent. She is taking on very low financial risk.
Okay, so let's lock this in. Firm commitment equals principal. Buying the whole lot, high risk. Best efforts equals agent, facilitating the sale, low risk. Those are the two pillars.
And just to add a bit of nuance, there are two conditional variations of best efforts that often pop up. They are still agency transactions. Ursula still isn't buying the stock, but they have specific performance strings attached. The first is an all or none offering.
This is exactly what it sounds like. Frank needs exactly $50 million to build a specific drone factory. If he only raises $20 million, he can't build half a factory. The money is useless to him.
Right.
So Ursula tells him, I will try to sell this as your agent, but if I can't sell every single share to hit that 50 million mark, the whole deal is off. We cancel the offering and we refund whatever money we already collected from the early investors. It's binary. 100% success or total cancellation.
And the second variation is a minimax offering. This establishes a floor and a ceiling.
A floor and a ceiling.
Yeah. Frank says, I really want 50 million to build a massive factory, but I could get away with building a smaller one for 20 million. So Ursula sets the terms. I need to sell at least $20 million worth. That is the minimum threshold. If we hit 20 million, the deal is officially on, and I'll keep selling up to a maximum of 50 million.
But what if they don't hit the 20?
If they fail to hit that minimum 20 million floor, the offering is entirely canceled and funds are returned. Just like all or none.
But notice the underlying mechanism here. In both all or none and minimax, Ursula never uses her own money to buy the stock. She is still just an agent. Do not let the complex conditions distract you from the fact that it is fundamentally a best efforts agreement.
Right. Keep your eye on the risk. So we understand the IPO process now, but let's fast forward in Frank's timeline. The IPO was years ago. He's a fully established public company. He's doing great.
Love to hear it.
But the drone delivery market is brutal. What if a rival company, let's call them Wafflecopter, suddenly announces they are launching a new, faster delivery drone next month? Oh no, Wafflecopter.
Yeah, Frank realizes he might need to raise another $50 million incredibly fast to upgrade his fleet to compete.
This is a massive problem for Frank. Does he have to go through that entire grueling, months-long SEC registration process all over again just to do a follow-on offering? I mean, by the time the SEC reviews all his paperwork and approves it, Wafflecopter will have already taken over the market.
That is exactly the friction the SEC recognized.
Mm-hmm.
They realized that forcing established public companies to go through the entire IPO-style waiting period every time they needed capital was highly inefficient. So they created SEC Rule 415, the shelf registration.
The shelf registration. I want you to think about Rule 415 like meal prepping for the week. If you wait until you are starving at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday to start cooking dinner from scratch, you're going to be miserable. You have to chop the onions, marinate the chicken, wait for the oven to preheat. It takes hours.
So how does a shelf registration change that? Well, if you meal prep on Sunday, you do all the hard work up front during a quiet period when you aren't stressed. You cook all the food, put it in Tupperware containers, and place it on the shelf in your fridge. Then, on Wednesday night, when you are starving, or in Frank's case, when Wafflecopter attacks and he suddenly needs cash, you just open the fridge, take the pre-approved food off the shelf, pop it in the microwave, and you are eating in 2 minutes.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Under Rule 415, Frank can register a massive amount of new stock with the SEC during a quiet period long before he actually needs the money. He files all the heavy paperwork, the financial disclosures, the legal opinions.
And the SEC reviews it.
Right. The SEC reviews it and declares the registration effective. But Frank doesn't sell the stock yet. Those pre-registered shares just sit on the metaphorical shelf.
And how long does that Tupperware stay fresh in the SEC's fridge?
Over the next 3 years. For 3 full years, Frank can pull those shares down and sell them into the open market at a moment's notice whenever market conditions are optimal or he suddenly needs capital.
3 years. That is the magic number you have to memorize for Rule 415. 3 years. The benefits here are massive. Market timing, he can wait until the stock price is at an all-time high to sell. Cost savings, he doesn't have to hire the lawyers for a full SEC filing every single time he wants to issue a few shares. And incredible strategic flexibility.
But here is where the exam will try to trip you up. Let's say Frank files his massive shelf registration paperwork on January 1st, and the SEC declares it effective on February 1st. The test asks, when are the securities in a shelf registration actually sold to the public?
Oh, this is a good one. Is it when the registration is filed or when it becomes effective? Think about the meal prep analogy. Do you eat the food the moment you put it in the fridge? No. The answer is that the securities are sold whenever the issuer decides to take them off the shelf.
Exactly.
It could be 6 months later. It could be 2.5 years later. These are delayed or continuous offerings. Filing the paperwork does not equal selling the stock.
Now, while meal prepping is great for a company like Frank's, the SEC realized that some corporations are so massively huge and their financials are so thoroughly tracked by Wall Street analysts every single day that making them wait for even a shelf registration review was redundant.
They're just too big to fail. Too big to wait.
Basically. So the SEC created a VIP FastPass lane. Enter the WKSI.
WKSI. It stands for Well-Known Seasoned Issuer. I love the word seasoned here. It implies they've been around the block. But how do you actually qualify for the VIP lane?
You have to hit some massive quantitative thresholds. To be a WKSI, a company needs to have a public float of at least $700 million.
Wait, stop right there. Public float.
Eh.
That means the value of the shares held by regular public investors, right? Not the shares held tightly by the founders or insider executives.
Exactly.
So there must be $700 million of this stock actively trading out in the wild. That proves the market is highly liquid and widely followed.
Right. Or, alternatively, if they don't hit the equity float, they must have issued at least $1 billion in non-convertible debt over the past 3 years. If you meet either of those thresholds, the SEC deems you a well-known, seasoned issuer.
So what is the actual perk of having the VIP pass?
The ultimate perk is something called automatic shelf effectiveness. If Frank's company grows to become a WKSI and he decides to file a shelf registration, he does not have to wait a single day for the SEC to review it.
Wait, not at all.
Not a single day. The exact moment he hits submit on the filing, the registration is immediately and automatically declared effective. He skips the SEC waiting room entirely.
Normal companies file a shelf registration and have to wait weeks for the SEC to say, okay, looks good. WKSIs get automatic, instant effectiveness. They can file in the morning and sell stock in the afternoon. It is the ultimate flex in corporate finance.
It really is. But let's rewind. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, before Frank was a WKSI, before we even had a shelf registration. Let's go back to his very first IPO. We've talked a lot about registering with the SEC. What does that actually mean?
It means mountains of paperwork. And to understand why, we have to look at the history of the Securities Act of 1933. Prior to 1933, the stock market was the Wild West. Promoters were selling shares in gold mines that didn't exist, railroads that were just lines drawn on a map. In 1929, the market spectacularly crashed, wiping out a massive amount of the nation's wealth and kicking off the Great Depression.
The government realized they had to step in, but their philosophy wasn't to outlaw risky investments. Their philosophy was transparency. The Securities Act of 1933 is often called the Truth in Securities Law.
Truth in Securities.
Yeah, it basically says if you want to sell stock to the public, you have to tell the public exactly what they are buying. You have to disclose every material fact.
And the mechanism for that disclosure is a massive document called a prospectus. When Frank and Ursula decide to do the IPO, they compile all of Frank's financials, the risks of drone delivery, the background of the executives, and they file an initial registration statement with the SEC.
And filing that initial document triggers what is legally known as the cooling off period. By law, this is a minimum of 20 days, though in reality, for a complex IPO, it can take months while the SEC meticulously reviews the documents, and this period is highly restricted.
Why? Why do they need to cool off?
Because before 1933, brokers would hype up a stock and pressure investors to buy it on the spot before they could even look at the company. The SEC mandated this cooling off period so that the market could digest the information without the pressure of a hard sale.
But Ursula is an investment banker. She can't just sit on her hands for months. During this cooling off period, Frank and Ursula are allowed to start gauging investor interest to see if this IPO is actually viable. They do this by distributing a preliminary prospectus,
Which is colloquially known on Wall Street as the red herring.
the red herring. I love this term. It sounds like a clue in an Agatha Christie murder mystery. Why is a financial document called a red herring?
Because it has a massive disclaimer printed right on the front cover, traditionally in bold red ink. That red disclaimer essentially screams at the investor, hey, this is not a final offer to sell. We are still working on this. The SEC has not cleared this yet.
So the red herring contains almost all the material information about Frank's business, the audited financials, the risk of syrup jamming the rotors, the management team's salaries. But it is explicitly missing two absolutely crucial pieces of information: the final offering price of the stock and the effective date when the stock will actually trade.
Because they don't know those things yet. They are using the red herring to figure out the price. Ursula travels around the country doing what's called a roadshow. She sits down with huge institutional investors, shows them the red herring, and basically asks, if we end up pricing this somewhere around $10 to $12 a share, hypothetically, how many shares would your mutual fund be interested in buying?
They're building an order book. They are taking a tally. But here's a critical question for you to consider. During this cooling off period, while Ursula is doing her roadshow, let's say she sits down with Ivan the angel investor.
Okay, Ivan's back.
Ivan reads the red herring. He loves the drone concept. And he says, Ursula, here is a check for $1 million. I want to buy those shares right now. Can Ursula take his check and legally sell him those shares? Give it a thought.
This is one of the most common ways the exam tests this concept. It will describe a scenario where a client reads a preliminary prospectus and immediately attempts to execute a trade.
What is the rule? Emphatically, absolutely. 100% NO. No sales are allowed during the cooling off period? None.
It violates the core premise of the Securities Act of 1933. You cannot sell security until the SEC declares the registration effective. Ursula can only collect indications of interest. It is a non-binding hypothetical. No money can change hands, and no legal commitments to buy can be made by either party.
Okay, so once the SEC finishes their exhaustive review and is satisfied that Frank hasn't hidden any material facts, we reach the end of the cooling off period. The SEC transitions the status of the registration.
They declare the registration statement effective. And this brings us to what I consider the ultimate conceptual trap on the entire exam.
Yes, listen to this phrasing. If a practice question says, after a thorough review, the SEC approved Frank's registration statement and endorsed the security for public sale. Is that a true statement?
It sounds incredibly plausible, but it is entirely false. The SEC never, ever, under any circumstances, approves or endorses a security.
Think about the implication of the word approved. If the government approves something, it sounds like they are guaranteeing it is a good, safe investment. The SEC absolutely does not do that. They do not care if Frank's business model is brilliant or if it is mathematically guaranteed to fail. They do not judge the merit of the investment. They aren't investment advisors.
They are simply compliance auditors. They only verify that Frank has provided all the required disclosures so that an investor can make their own informed decision. They check the math. They verify the footnotes.
Right. Section 8 of the 33 Act governs this. The SEC declares the registration effective. That word just means the legal waiting period is over, the paperwork is complete, and sales can legally begin. It is a subtle semantic difference, but it is one of the most heavily tested concepts on the SE. Effective, yes. Approved, never.
Once it is effective, Frank and Ursula finalize the exact public offering price, and they print the final prospectus. Under Section 10 of the Act, this final document must be delivered to any investor who buys the public offering at or before the time of sale.
It has everything in it.
Yeah, it has the final price, the effective date, the specific use of proceeds, everything that was missing from the red herring.
And while the prospectus is the gold standard for corporate public offerings, you need to be able to recognize the equivalent disclosure documents in other corners of the financial markets. The concept is exactly the same disclosure, but the names change. Let's run through these quickly so you can spot them on a matching question.
Sure. If Mayor Frank is issuing those municipal bonds for his pancake bridge,
He doesn't use a prospectus. The SEC doesn't have the same direct authority over state and local governments. Under MSRB Rule G32, municipal issuers provide an official statement, or OS. It serves the exact same purpose, full disclosure of the city's finances and the bond terms. But it's the specific vocabulary used for munis.
what about mutual funds? By law, mutual funds are continuously offering new shares to the public, which means they always have to provide a prospectus. But those statutory prospectuses can be hundreds of pages of dense legal jargon.
Right, nobody reads them. So for mutual funds, SEC Rule 431 allows for something called a summary prospectus. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a highly condensed, plain English version of the key facts, the fees, the investment objectives, the historical performance, and the primary risks. Investors can always request the full, long-form statutory prospectus if they want to read it, but the summary prospectus is what usually gets delivered first to satisfy the disclosure rule.
And what if Frank didn't go public at all? What if he did that VIP-only private dinner we talked about earlier?
For private placements, since they are exempt from SEC registration, there is no SEC-reviewed prospectus. But the issuer still needs to provide material facts to those wealthy investors. So they draft a private placement memorandum, or PPM. It looks and acts like a prospectus, but it hasn't gone through the SEC's grueling review process.
Which brings us perfectly to the next massive topic, skipping the line. Exemptions and Regulation D. We've spent all this time talking about the massive headache of SEC registration, the cooling off period, the red herrings, the legal fees, the waiting.
We established that the whole point of the 1933 Act is to protect the public. But the downside of that protection is that it is staggeringly expensive and slow. What if Frank looks at all that paperwork and says, no way, I don't have the time or the millions of dollars in legal fees required to do an IPO. I just need to raise cash quickly to build my drones.
The authors of the Securities Act of 1933 anticipated this. Under Sections 3 and 4 of the Act, they carved out specific exemptions. They basically said, if you meet these very narrow, specific criteria, we will let you raise money without filing a full registration statement.
And the undisputed king of these exemptions, the one that powers almost all of Silicon Valley and the venture capital world, is Regulation D, the private placement exemption.
Reg D is the VIP room. But there are different tiers to this VIP room, and the exam expects you to know exactly how they differ. I want to do a side-by-side comparison of the 3 Reg D rules you need to know. Rule 504, Rule 506B, and Rule 506C.
Let's start with the smallest one. Rule 504. Think of this as the friends and family tier, or like a small local business raise. It allows a company to raise up to $10 million in a 12-month period. Because the total dollar amount is relatively small in the grand scheme of capital markets, the SEC is a bit more relaxed here. You can sell to any type of investor. They don't have to be millionaires.
Right. $10 million is the hard cap for Rule 504. But what if Frank needs way more than $10 million? What if he needs $100 million to build a global drone fleet?
Then Rule 504 is useless to him. He has to look to Rule 506. And this is where it gets fascinating because there are 2 distinct flavors of 506. Let's look at 506B first. Under 506B, Frank can raise an absolutely unlimited amount of money. He could raise $1 billion if he wanted to.
Unlimited capital sounds fantastic, but the SEC isn't just going to let him raise $1 billion in the dark without a catch. The catch lies in who he can take the money from and how he is allowed to ask for it.
Okay, under 506B, he can sell to an unlimited number of accredited investors. These are the VIPs. Institutions, banks, or wealthy individuals with over $1 million in net worth, excluding their primary residence, or individuals who have consistently high income of over $200,000 a year. The SEC says, you guys are rich enough to fend for yourselves. You don't need a prospectus.
But, and this is a highly tested exception under 506B, Frank is also allowed to sell to a maximum of 35 non-accredited investors, everyday people. However, those 35 non-accredited folks must be deemed sophisticated, meaning they have enough financial knowledge and experience to evaluate the risks of the investment.
Wait, hold on. I've always wondered about this. Under 506B, Frank can take money from 35 regular people as long as they are sophisticated. How does the SEC even police that? What makes someone officially sophisticated enough to lose their life savings on unproven pancake drones?
It is a notoriously gray area. Usually it means they have an extensive background in finance, or they are advised by a purchaser representative like a CPA or a lawyer who can translate the risks for them. The burden is on Frank to prove he reasonably believed they were sophisticated before he took their money.
Okay, so unlimited rich people and up to 35 smart, normal people. But here is the massive catch for 506B. Frank cannot use any general solicitation. No advertising whatsoever.
None. He cannot run a Facebook ad. He cannot put up a billboard on the highway. He cannot go on a podcast and say, hey, invest in my company. He can only approach people with whom he already has a substantive pre-existing relationship. It must be truly private.
But Frank is a modern startup founder. He loves Facebook ads. He wants to blast his pitch deck to the entire world to build hype. He goes to his lawyers and says, I want to run a Super Bowl commercial asking for investors, and I still want to raise unlimited money. Can he do that?
He can. But he has to switch his exemption to Rule 506C. This is the second flavor. Under 506C, general solicitation broad advertising is explicitly allowed. Frank can buy that Super Bowl commercial.
So what's the trade-off? Why wouldn't everyone just use 506C if it lets you advertise?
Because the SEC says, if you are going to shout about this risky, unregistered investment from the rooftops where everyday people can hear you, we have to protect them. So under 506C, if you advertise, you can only accept money from verified accredited investors. 0 non-accredited investors allowed. Not even one. Not even if they are sophisticated.
Okay, let's review that side by side because it's guaranteed to show up on your test. Rule 506B, NO, advertising allowed. Up to 35 non-accredited investors allowed. Rule 506C. Advertising IS allowed. 0 non-accredited investors allowed. Only verified rich folks. The SEC is basically trading marketing freedom for investor protection.
And regardless of which Reg D rule Frank uses, he must file a simple document called Form D with the SEC within 15 days of his first sale. It's not a prospectus. It's just a short notice telling the SEC, hey, we exist and we raise money privately under this specific exemption.
But remember our theme.
Right.
There is no such thing as a free lunch in the capital markets. Frank skipped the grueling SEC registration process. He saved millions in legal fees and months of time. But what is the trade-off for the investor who actually buys the stock? Let's go back to Ivan.
Let's do it.
Ivan buys $1 million of Frank's stock in a Reg D private placement. 6 months later, Ivan decides he wants his yacht. Can Ivan wake up, call his broker, and just sell that private stock on the New York Stock Exchange to a retail investor? Give it a thought.
He absolutely cannot, and the logic here is vital. Because that stock was issued privately, it was never registered with the SEC. The public never received a prospectus. The SEC protects the public by labeling Ivan's shares as restricted securities. They are illiquid. They are locked up. He cannot freely resell them into the public markets immediately.
He has to play a waiting game, which is governed by SEC Rule 144. Rule 144 is the gateway that allows private, restricted stock to eventually be sold into a public market.
So how long does the SEC force Ivan to wait before he can sell? The answer depends entirely on what kind of company Frank runs. Rule 144 has 2 distinct holding periods based on the transparency of the issuer.
Right. So if Frank's company is a reporting company, meaning they're already a public company that just happened to do a private raise on the side, and they regularly file their quarterly 10Q and annual 10K financial reports with the SEC, Ivan only has to wait 6 months.
Why only 6 months? Because the company is already reporting. There is already a massive trail of public audited information out there about Frank's business. The market isn't blind, so the SEC feels comfortable letting Ivan sell his restricted shares after a relatively short holding period.
But what if Frank's company is a non-reporting company, a totally private startup in a garage? They don't file public financial reports. They are a black box. The SEC says, we have no idea what's going on inside this company, and neither does the public. So they make Ivan wait a full 12 months.
6 months for reporting, 12 months for non-reporting. Those are the holding periods for restricted stock. Now, after Ivan waits his required time, he is a non-affiliate. He's just a regular outside investor. Once the holding period clears, the restriction is lifted, and Ivan can sell his shares freely into the open market without any limits.
But what if the person trying to sell is Frank himself?
This introduces the concept of control stock. Frank is the CEO. He is a founder, an insider, a director. In SEC terminology, he is an affiliate of the company. Let's say Frank's shares have cleared the holding period. He's held them for years. Can Frank just dump all his shares on the market at once to buy his own yacht?
Think about the psychological impact of that. If the CEO of the company suddenly sells 100% of his stock on a random Tuesday, what is the market going to think? They are going to panic. They will assume the drones are crashing and the company is bankrupt. The stock price will crater, destroying the value for all the regular retail investors.
To prevent those kinds of catastrophic market signals, Rule 144 dictates that affiliates insiders like Frank are always subject to strict volume limits when they sell their own company's stock, regardless of how long they've held it.
How much can he sell? It's a very specific math formula. During any 90-day period, an affiliate can sell the greater of 1% of the total outstanding shares of the company, or the average weekly trading volume over the prior 4 weeks.
The greater of 1% or the 4-week average. By forcing insiders to drip feed their shares into the market slowly over time, the SEC prevents sudden supply shocks that would crash the stock price. And additionally, Frank has to file a Form 144 with the SEC notifying them of his intent to sell if he is selling more than 5,000 shares or $50,000 worth of stock.
So to summarize Rule 144, Ivan, the regular outside investor, waits his 6 or 12 months, and then he can sell whatever he wants. Frank, the insider affiliate, waits his time, but he is forever restricted by volume limits to protect the market.
That is exactly right. Now, Reg D and Rule 144 are the titans of the exemption world, but there are a few other specific exemptions we need to volley back and forth. You don't necessarily need to know their deep history, but you must be able to recognize the rule numbers and match them to their primary audience.
Let's do a rapid-fire breakdown. I'll pitch the rule, you tell me the target audience. First up, Rule 144A. Notice the capital A at the end. How is that different from regular Rule 144?
Rule 144A is the billionaire's dark room. It allows for the immediate resale of restricted securities, completely skipping the 6 or 12-month holding periods we just talked about. But here is the catch. You can only sell those shares to a qualified institutional buyer, or QIB.
What makes an institution a QIB?
A QIB must be a massive institution that manages at least $100 million in discretionary assets. Basically, if two colossal institutions like a massive pension fund and a giant insurance company want to trade unregistered, restricted stock with each other, the SEC steps out of the way. The philosophy is, you are both managing billions of dollars, you have armies of lawyers, you don't need our protection, go ahead and trade. No holding periods apply.
Unbelievable. Okay, next rule, Rule 145.
Rule 145 covers corporate reorganizations. If Frank's company decides to merge with Wafflecopter and they need to issue new shares to facilitate that merger or to reclassify their existing stock, Rule 145 often exempts those newly minted shares from the standard, grueling IPO registration process. It smooths the path for M&A activity.
Makes sense. Okay, Rule 147 and its modern cousin, 147A.
This is the intrastate exemption. Intra, meaning within a single state. The SEC is a federal agency. Their jurisdiction is interstate commerce business that crosses state lines. If Frank's business is entirely headquartered in Texas and he only sells stock to residents of Texas, the federal SEC essentially says, this isn't our jurisdiction. We don't need to register it at the federal level.
But wait, if the federal SEC steps back, it's not just a free-for-all, right? Someone still has to police it.
Absolutely. If the feds step back, the state regulators step up. The state of Texas would regulate that offering heavily, which we will get to in just a minute.
Right. Okay, last one in the rapid-fire exemption list. Regulation A, or Reg A+.
Reg A is a fascinating middle ground. It is often called a mini IPO. It's designed for smaller, emerging companies that want to raise money from the general public, but simply cannot afford the massive legal and accounting fees of a standard S1 IPO registration. Think of it as the minor leagues before hitting the major stock exchanges.
How much can they raise in the minor leagues?
It has two tiers. Tier 1 allows a company to raise up to $20 million in a 12-month period. Tier 2 allows you to raise up to $75 million, but Tier 2 requires much stricter ongoing reporting and audited financials. If you see mini IPO or those $20 million and $75 million thresholds on the exam, you are looking at Reg A.
All right, we just mentioned the SEC stepping back on intrastate offerings and letting the states handle it. That perfectly sets up our final major concept: state lines, blue sky laws, and NSMIA.
Everything we have talked about so far today, the Securities Act of 1933, the SEC, Reg D, Rule 144, that is all federal law. It applies to the entire country. But the United States has a dual regulatory system. Each individual state, from California to New York to Ohio, also has its own independent securities laws and its own state securities administrator.
And these state-level regulations are famously called blue sky laws. I always love the history behind this name. Why are they called blue sky laws? Because back in the early 1900s, before the federal SEC even existed, scam artists would roll into small rural towns. They would set up a tent and sell shares in fake gold mines or non-existent railroads to local farmers. A Supreme Court justice famously complained that these promoters would try to sell investors so many feet of blue sky. They were selling nothing but empty, fraudulent promises.
So the states began passing laws to protect their citizens from buying blue sky. Today, these state regulators are highly organized and coordinated by an umbrella group called NAFA, the North American Securities Administrators Association. Under blue sky laws, a broker-dealer firm, the individual agents working for that firm, and the securities themselves generally have to be explicitly registered in the specific state where the transaction takes place.
So let's play out the logistics of this. If Frank does his massive public IPO and he wants to sell his drone stock to people in all 50 states, does he have to fill out registration paperwork for the federal SEC and 50 separate individual state regulators? Because that sounds like an administrative nightmare that would grind capitalism to a halt.
It used to be exactly that kind of nightmare. It was incredibly inefficient, but in 1996, Congress realized this dual system was choking the capital markets. So they passed the National Securities Markets Improvement Act, commonly known as NSMIA. And this is a massive, heavily tested concept. NSMIA established a legal doctrine of federal preemption.
Federal preemption. Let's build an analogy for this. I think of NSMIA like the relationship between the Federal Highway Patrol and local mall cops.
Walk us through that.
Okay, think of the SEC as the Federal Highway Patrol and the state securities administrators as the local mall cops. Both have authority, but in different jurisdictions. NSMIA basically created a category called covered securities. The federal government looked at the states and said, listen, if a massive 18-wheeler truck is big enough to be driving on the federal interstate highway, we, the feds, are handling it. You local mall cops are not allowed to pull that truck over and ask for local registration. We are preempting your authority.
That is exactly how it works. NSMIA said that if a security is big enough and heavily regulated enough by the SEC, the states cannot force that security to undergo a second redundant state-level registration process.
So who gets to drive on the interstate? Who gets the VIP pass? What actually qualifies as a covered security under NSMIA?
The big ones are companies listed on major national stock exchanges. If Frank lists his flapjack company on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, he is immediately a covered security. The states cannot make him register locally. Mutual funds are also considered covered securities because they're so heavily regulated by the Investment Company Act of 1940. And importantly, those Rule 506 Regulation D private placements we spent so much time on, those are also federally covered securities. States cannot require local registration for a 506 offering either.
But wait, we need to pause right here. Let's really test this concept. Does this mean the state regulators have absolutely no power over these covered securities? Are the local mall cops completely stripped of their badges? Because this leads to a massive exam trap.
It is the trap that catches the most test takers on the state regulation section. Let's hear the scenario.
Okay, Frank is doing a Rule 506 private placement. We know it is exempt from SEC registration because of Red D, and we just learned it is a covered security, meaning it is preempted from state registration because of NSMIA. So Frank essentially has no active registration requirements anywhere. Frank gets greedy. He decides to just straight up lie on his private placement memorandum. He tells investors that his drones run on revolutionary cold fusion instead of lithium batteries. He knows it's a lie, but he thinks, hey, I'm exempt from the SEC and NSMIA says the states can't touch me. I'm totally immune from prosecution. Is Frank right? What do you think?
Frank is going to spend a very long time in federal prison. He is absolutely wrong. There is a fundamental rule in securities law. Exempt from registration does not mean exempt from anti-fraud rules.
Say that again, because it is the golden rule of the industry.
Exempt from registration does not mean exempt from anti-fraud rules. The SEC and the state regulators always retain anti-fraud authority. It is universal. If you lie, cheat, steal, or omit a material fact in the sale of a security, it does not matter if it was a covered security, a Reg D private placement, an intrastate offering, or a government bond. Fraud is fraud. The state administrator can and will prosecute you for deceit, even if NSMIA preempted them from forcing you to register the security in the first place.
The exam will explicitly try to trick you with a statement like, because the security was a covered security exempt from state registration under NSMIA, the state administrator has no jurisdiction over the offering whatsoever. That statement is false. The administrator always has jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute fraud. They can always pull you over if you were driving drunk, even if you were on the federal highway.
That is a critical absolute note to end the substantive material on. The anti-fraud provisions are the bedrock of the entire system. They apply to everyone, everywhere, at all times.
All right. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, from Frank's syrup-stained garage through the underwriting syndicates, all the way to federal preemption and the Supreme Court. Let's lock this knowledge in with a rapid-fire recap of the absolute most testable concepts we hit today.
Number 1, underwriting commitments. Remember the car dealer versus the real estate agent. A firm commitment means the underwriter acts as a principal. They buy the whole issue with their own money and take the financial risk. A best efforts commitment means the underwriter acts as an agent. They just try to sell it for commission and return what they can't sell. Low risk.
Number 2, follow the proceeds. In a primary offering like an IPO or a follow-on, new shares are created and the issuer gets the money. In a secondary offering, existing shareholders are cashing out. The sellers get the money, the company itself gets zero.
Number 3, the true role of the SEC. The SEC only declares a registration effective, meaning the paperwork is complete. They check the math and the disclosure. They never, ever approve, guarantee, or endorse the merit of a security.
Number 4, the cooling off period. You can use a preliminary prospectus, the red herring, to gather non-binding indications of interest. But there are NO sales and no money collected until the effective date.
Number 5, Rule 144 holding periods for restricted, unregistered stock. It is a 6-month wait if the company is already public and reporting to the SEC. It is a 12-month wait if it is a private, non-reporting company. And remember, affiliates, insiders like CEOs always face strict volume limits when selling to prevent them from crashing the market.
And finally, number 6, the golden rule we just covered. Exempt from registration does not mean exempt from anti-fraud. You lie on a private placement, you buy a ticket to jail. NSMIA doesn't protect you from fraud charges.
That is the mechanical core of securities offerings. If you can keep those functional distinctions clear in your mind and remember the why behind the rules, you are going to easily navigate those 12 questions on the exam.
Exactly. You've got the rules, you've got the historical context, and you've got the mechanics of how this massive machine works.
But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final, broader thought to mull over while you study.
I think it's important to look at the big picture. We've talked a lot today about the strict rules keeping companies honest. The SEC, the exhaustive prospectuses, the 1933 Act. The entire goal of this massive regulatory apparatus is to protect the average, everyday investor from losing their shirt. But think about the unintended consequences. Because going public is so incredibly expensive, difficult, and legally perilous, the private markets, like those Regulation D offerings, are growing exponentially faster and larger than the public stock exchanges. The best, most innovative startups aren't doing IPOs early anymore. They are staying private for a decade or more. So here's the question. Are everyday investors actually being protected by these strict public rules? Or, by making public offerings so difficult, are everyday investors just being systematically locked out of the best early-stage wealth generation, leaving all the massive, life-changing gains exclusively for the accredited billionaires sitting in the VIP room?
That is the defining tension at the heart of modern capital markets. It's a profound debate about balancing public protection against equal economic access.
Keep that dynamic in the back of your mind as you look at how the market is shifting today. When you realize these rules aren't just dry text, but actively shape who gets to build wealth in society, the regulations feel a lot more real and a lot easier to remember. Good luck studying. You've got this. Catch you on the next deep dive.